initiatives. He's got leadership for the Religion and Public Sphere program, which works on the Council's Africa-focused activities, and is managing editor of the SSRC's digital forums. Prior to the Social Sciences Research Council in 2005, he was an associate dean at the New School for Social Research and associate professor in the Department of Politics. And in 2007, he worked for 6 years as an associate provost for research and special projects. His PhD is in social science from the University of Chicago, and he's published on religion, civil society, higher education, and globalization in Africa. So many of you in the room know Dr. Kassimir, and you know his work, and you're familiar with him in the context of the work you all do in area studies. But for me, I had the great pleasure of meeting Ron Kassimir in 2016 at Rutgers University for a summer meeting of the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities. And there was a collection of folks in the room, many senior international officers, some folks who had international portfolios like I do. And it came at a time when we were here in international studies and programs with kind of a new leadership team in ISP, in the Dean's Office, many new directors in the units across ISP. And we were involved in a strategic planning process, thinking about what's the future, what's the opportunity for capturing the great work that's going on at Michigan State University across many geographical regions, across many disciplinary topics, and how can ISP support and facilitate those efforts? So when Ron Kassimir got up and gave a talk that I think he's going to elaborate on today, you know, he was bringing into sharp focus and great clarity opportunities around interdisciplinarity, bringing kind of some of the non-traditional disciplines into area studies, looking at partner-led and partner-initiated types of programs. And the resonance was unbelievable because we were having similar conversations here at Michigan State. And some of you probably heard Dean Hansen's remarks this morning, and he may have mentioned to you that as we're trying to articulate a strategic vision for Michigan State's international footprint, we're thinking about thematic areas of focus. We're thinking about regional expertise and we're thinking about the relationships and values that are important in an international context. All the while trying to think about advancing scholarly directions for campus, enhancing our student experience, looking at issues of diversity and inclusivity. So we are really fortunate to have Ron Kassimir today, I hope is in kind of a reprise and an expansion of thinking about specifically the role of an area studies unit in looking at this kind of new landscape and horizon. And I was just thrilled to hear his talk in 2016, and it's just a really pleasure to have you back. So with that, I invite you to come share some wisdom with us, Ron.
Thank you. Yeah.
Liz? Where's Liz? Can you help us bring the PPT up?
I think I'm already behind. Oh, okay. So while we're working on this, there was something I needed to say before I started my talk, and I believe it would best be summed up as go Spartans.
Go green.
Yeah.
Go green?
Yeah.
Green, go green. Sorry. I didn't have you guys in my office bracket, but I'm still rooting for you. Hope it works. Thanks. So thank you, Jamie, and thank you, Deandra, and thanks for having me here. It's a real pleasure and to be here at Michigan State and be hosted by the legendary Michigan State African Studies Center. I've been here once before, and John Metzel and I were trying to figure out when, but it was when our memories were much stronger than they are now. But it's great to be back. So I'll kind of go through the slides and talk a bit, but do feel free if anything jumps out at you that you don't want to wait around for the discussion, which I'm hoping we'll have plenty of time for. Feel free to let me know. And I want to start with a rhetorical question, maybe rhetorical, but a question that goes like this. If area studies didn't exist today, didn't exist both as a field and as an institutional expression on university campuses, would we have to invent it? And I say that, I have the we in quotes there because there would be a passive voice version of that question, and that would go, if area studies didn't exist, would it need to be invented? But I didn't want to say it that way because I think there's this way of phrasing it is more honest, and it calls attention to who the we is. That's not going to be the topic mainly of this talk, but I think it would be very important to come back to it in the discussion if you wish. But I think whenever that cliched question of if something didn't exist, should we have to invent it, is used, it always begs that we question. So just have that one in the back of your mind. And so my answer, personal answer, this is for me, is yes, but. And so what's my but is not in quite the way it was originally imagined and institutionalized. So yes, we'd have to invent it, but not in the way it was originally imagined and institutionalized. Now, each of us probably has our own different answers to that question and what would follow the but if you do say yes. And this talk is mostly going to give you my version of it, but I'm hoping that in the discussion we can get your versions of it on the table. So here's the kind of my overview for what I'm going to go through. First is what was area studies? Meaning what was it both up until some of the particular pressures on it arose toward the end of the Cold War, immediately after the Cold War and up until today. What are those pressures, those four strong winds? For those of you of my era, you'll recognize a reference to an old folk song. Four strong winds of change since the end of the Cold War, and then conclude with what is area studies today, and what could it be tomorrow? What are the ways in which it can go? The four strong winds, the strong winds are what I would call the pressure points, and I'll get to them in a minute. There have been many creative responses to these pressures in the last 25 years. We've talked even a bit about some of them in the symposium that we're having around this talk, and I'm going to really give you a bird's eye view. I'm not going to go into any of the details of what are some of those responses. A lot of what I'm going to say about what the pressures are and what some of the responses are not new, and they haven't gone unnoticed or acted upon. So this talk is mainly a call for bringing the disparate ongoing experiments and innovations in rethinking and reimagining area studies, bringing them together in ways and learning from them in ways that respond to the pressures that have been put upon us. And a main goal, a main takeaway I want you to have from this discussion is that what we often construe or assume to be zero-sum relationships between area studies and something else. Oh, sorry. Yeah? Did I knock it out of commission?
I
think it's this up here. That might, let me try to clip it here.
Okay.
I've never seen a bobby pin used for that, but okay.
Does that work now? That's better.
Is that better?
Okay, thanks, sorry. So a main goal of the talk is to argue that what is often construed or assumed to be zero-sum relationships between area studies and something else. We talked about this already this morning, global studies, the relationship between research and practice, you name what the other is, are not actually zero-sum relationships or need not be. And part of what I want to hope we can talk about in the discussion are ways in which they need not be. So with that, I'm going to focus particularly on African studies, partly because of where we are, but it's also largely to do with who I am and what I know well, and what I assume at least quite a few of you in the room are interested in. And so if you'll forgive a few minutes of personal biography, I'm really a product of area studies and African studies. As a student, I got a certificate, not a degree, because Columbia, did my master's at Columbia, but a certificate in African studies along with my master's. I had a FLAS in Swahili. It was the only way I could afford finishing that master's degree, was getting that FLAS, so thank you, Department of Education. And I had research grants to do my doctoral research from the Fulbright Hayes Africa program and from the SSRC as well. And then after that, I spent 3 years as the assistant director of the African Studies Center at Columbia. I went back there, writing Title VI grants, managing Title VI grants, and from there spent 10 years at the SSRC as the program director for the Africa portfolio before I went to the new school, and then so I've come back to SSRC. But I spent 10 years there doing the Africa work, and also part of that time overseeing the International Dissertation and Research Fellowship Program, which some of you, if you're students, you probably have applied for if you're looking to do doctoral research in Africa or other parts of the world. So I speak, from coming out of as a product of this project, this area studies project. I did want to just say that given all this, I really want to recommend that some graduate student out there write a really great history of African studies. There have actually been some fantastic histories of other area studies, and here are two that I've been reading that are fairly new, one by Zachary Lockman on the Middle East, and the other by David Engerman on Soviet studies with the great title, Know Your Enemy. And there have been some fantastic research done on African studies by Paul Zaleza, by Jane Geyer, by Pearl Robinson and others, but it hasn't quite congealed in like a single monograph that we can really dig our teeth into and argue with. So just a plug. I think it would really need reading Lockman's book recently. I kept thinking, he actually went into the archives of the SSRCs from the 1950s and the early days of the Committee on Middle East Studies, and there's versions of that you could do on African studies as well. So I think it's really important. All right, so what was African studies? Or what was area studies, and especially African studies? It predated World War II. That's something that in almost all regions of the world is true. None of these things were creatures of the Cold War or inventions of the Cold War. They were transformed and institutionalized during World War II and after the Cold War. And that institutionalization was through hundreds of centers, scholarly associations, the African Studies Association, the Latin American Studies Associations, thousands of PhDs, most of whom were trained in disciplines, but who received deep area expertise language training, and took on a deep knowledge of context. I won't focus on it a lot, but it is important to remember that African studies, especially we have a colleague here, where's Wheeler from Howard. So Howard and a couple of other HBCUs were really doing major work on African studies long before World War II in the 20s and 30s. There's a history there that, again, it's not the topic of this talk that needs to be raised at some points about that sort of pre-World War II history of African studies, pre-huge investments of American and government and foundation money in the field. And area studies was an early and extensive and largely successful experiment, and I use the word experiment intentionally, in interdisciplinarity, in internationalization, and in American higher education as it grew out of the Cold War and grew out of World War II and into the Cold War, and many new resources came its way. It created an alliance in the United States between government, private foundations, NGOs like SSRC, scholarly associations, and obviously research universities. And that growth in institutionalization largely was a project of the late 40s and early 50s to contribute to fighting the Cold War and projecting American economic, political, and cultural power, to provide expertise on parts of the world for a superpower that had historically been quite insular in terms of the knowledge it had of different parts of the world. And these were also places where most universities themselves lacked expertise, lacked experts and faculty who could teach and do research on the histories, cultures, and politics of other areas. Again, the exception for Africa was Howard and a couple of the other HBCUs. So which disciplines form the historical core of area studies? And again, that will vary from region to region, right? There's not a single answer to this. Here, I think, is a general, very general a list of the ones that certainly are, have predominantly led African studies, but also some other areas. And I would guess that even today, if anyone did a census of the panels and presentations at area studies conferences and looked for the fields that most faculty and students were presenting, that still a pretty high percentage of them would come from these fields. There might have been a few disciplines that would have been on there 30, 40 years ago, like economics that came up again this morning, that once did have a stronger role in intersecting with area studies, but has not in quite a long time. So now, what happened over time? These fields become the core of area studies. Resources are put in through federal government, through a range of foundations, especially Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Ford, largely again to develop this American expertise. And then at some point in the 60s and 70s, a lot of the researchers being trained started being very critical of American policy. And so, sometimes I wouldn't say that that's the only reason why down the road we wound up getting in some of the resource constraints that we've had to fight a lot harder in the last 30 years to get support through the State Department and Department of Education for things like African studies. I don't think the only reason for that is that it was perceived by the powers that be that the hand that they were feeding with got bit, but I think that's part of it. And so area studies in that period up until now, or up until recently, I'd say, remained an American project, but the practitioners did not see it as a project that was principally, in their minds, to deepen America's global power. And so many scholars trained through area studies programs, including those who received government funding, emerged as deeply critical. And so I think that I partly say that in part because there's a tendency in the shorthand of thinking about the historiography of area studies to say product of the Cold War. handmaidens of American power, very true in the early decades, much more complicated and mixed after that. So then the Cold War ends, an identity crisis begins for all of us who have been living through that, and the rationale for government funding with the end of the Cold War becoming less clear. On the foundation side, many of the foundations who supported area studies essentially declared victory. American higher education seems to be self-reproducing area expertise. Time to move on to other things. One of those other things, to some degree, was globalization. This was when it was the craze, what did I call it? A bright, shiny object. Oh, here's something new, we got to go for that. And there were some reasons, there were some serious intellectual and policy reasons to have that discussion. It wasn't empty, but it did figure into this kind of zero-sum logic of more of that, more of global means less of area. But beyond that, a lot of the foundations that had initially invested in area studies, and not just area studies, but other forms of kind of building deep capacity within higher education to do research, shifted into much more social change agendas that only were interested in research to the degree that it directly intersected with and shaped those policy or social change agendas. So research as a long-term project became much less of a priority for many, if not most, foundations. Today, there are some exceptions, but some of the major foundations who were part of this space up until the 90s are not anymore. And for Africa, I can say, because this was what was affecting a lot of the work and the work that we were doing at SSRC and shifts in it, were that funders shifted priorities to building capacity in Africa rather than American expertise on it. And I think, again, we can come back to that as not necessarily a zero-sum kind of calculus. So what are these four winds of change I've been talking about? And there is a typo on my balloon chart. So the first one up here, as you'll notice, is the same as that one. And that shouldn't be. So one of them should be directions in research and training, especially around issues that are global or transnational or transregional. So one of the wins is an intellectual one that I just alluded to about we know a lot about areas of supposedly we don't know how they connect and affect each other, or we don't understand that so many important public or social and global issues and problems aren't contained within one part of the world. So that's one wind. The second pressure is, as I mentioned, coming partly from the foundations, the collaboration with scholars and institutions in the region and supporting work there. Again, that will vary very much depending on the region. Third is collaboration with fields that are not in the core that I mentioned of the core fields of area studies. It could be the sciences, applied fields, professional schools, art and design. And the fourth is the engagement with practice, policy, and the public. And so each of those, and I'll go through them a little bit more in a moment, are what I see as the kind of the principal pressures that arose in that post-Cold War period that have been buffeting area studies for now over 20 years. And the arrows pointing at the balloon, which is a balloon of the world, but with Africa facing you all. Not very good at these visual things, so forgive me, but you get the picture. And the arrow was pointing toward them because we were all very reactive then. It was like, these things are coming at us. The center isn't holding. How do we make sure things don't fall apart? And I think we've learned a lot in the last 25 years, and that's, partly what I hope we can talk about. So let me give you, go through the wins, the pressure points in a little bit more detail. So as I mentioned, the first one is directions and research and training. The idea and the understanding that areas are porous, the things that happen outside them affect them, and we need to understand how that works, but also the things that happen in areas affect other areas. And so how do we use area knowledge to make comparisons and understand transnational and trans-regional phenomena? There's global connectedness and power relations across countries and regions. That there was also a critique that area boundaries, regional boundaries, were arbitrary and products of colonial and other political and geopolitical power relationships. And the sources of this critique came from some funders and also from within the academy. Interestingly, I would argue that the attacks on area studies, interestingly, in the 90s came from both the more scientific, or if you prefer scientific oriented social sciences, like economics and political science, saying that area studies was kind of mere description, but also from a lot of the post-structural and postmodern critiques in cultural studies and elsewhere that also saw area studies as atheoretical. And so it kind of was coming at it, it was kind of getting hit from a bunch of different places. I won't say more now on this. It's a big part of the topic we have in our symposium, and there's a lot of really smart people in this room who've thought a lot about it. I use the word porous, or I adopted from Peter Katzenstein's work on regionalism, which and it's really kind of affected my understanding of this. And his work is about how regions are porous. And I guess what I want to, the signal or message I want to send is that if areas are porous, area studies are porous. By definition, they're both inevitably porous, and that's what we need to think about, is how can we make that porousness to a strength and something that helps preserve the core values of what area studies represents, meaning deep knowledge of a place and the importance of context, without reifying that to the degree that we can't have these discussions around connections. So, porousness may or may not be a good thing. By using it, I don't mean a judgment of it, but I think it's a fact of life. It's there, and so what we do about it is to me the main question. And just this next slide is a very provocative version of that. A quote from something I read recently as I started reading back up on this. I don't know if I sign off on it myself, but I think I found it very provocative and a way to think with. It's one of your colleagues, Shabana. Area studies without global studies are blind, and global studies without area studies are empty. I think that says a truth in a way too extreme way, but I think in its extremity, it actually has, for me, it's been valuable to think with. And we can, if you like, we can go back to that at another time, or in the discussion. Okay, so enough of that. Strong win number 2 is support for and engagement with scholars and institutions in the region. And I talked a little bit about that. Pressures on the U.S. African Studies community to build capacity and foster collaborations in Africa, where the needs were so much obviously greater. This was coming a lot from funders, a lot from diaspora scholars, and from scholars in the region. And I would say, in some ways, of the 4 pressure points for SSRC, this is the one that we really have picked up on, and have colleagues here in the audience who've worked really hard on this, is building up over the last 2 decades a range of ways of supporting and engaging with scholars in the region. We have 2 Carnegie funded programs that support somewhere between 50 to 60 African scholars annually to do work on peace, security, and development, very broadly defined. But there have been other programs too. Obviously, you're doing quite a bit here at MSU. But that became a kind of focus for SSRC in the wake of all that buffeting around area studies. Not just in Africa, but we've been especially successful in doing work with in Africa with the African social science community. Third is this demand for deeper collaboration with the full range of scholars and applied fields beyond the social sciences and humanities, or maybe even including some of the social sciences and humanities, let's say like the arts on the humanities side, or like psychology and economics on the social science side, and here the question and the push was how to use area knowledge to make comparison and to understand transnational phenomena and address public good issues that cut across problems that cut across not just the different social sciences and humanities, but across a whole range of fields. And you can name the problems from climate change. We hear this all the time, but especially bringing in fields like public health, or schools like public health, education, business, social work, design, the natural sciences, arts and design. A lot of push for this was coming from some funders, certainly from university administrators. A lot of it kind of came alongside of, not specific to area studies, but alongside of a push around, especially places like National Science Foundation and others, for team science, for team research. And the idea that this wasn't about having a sociologist also become a climatologist. It was about finding ways to build those teams. Now, a lot of cautionary tales abound for us in the social sciences and humanities. We've all seen how a project gets cooked up around climate change or the environment, and it sort of, after it's all been designed, someone says, oh yeah, we need a token anthropologist, or we need a token someone who knows about the place that the rest of us don't, right? So there's a lot of dangers in doing this, but that can only mean that we have to work hard to get it done right, because I don't think it's feasible anymore not to think about how to do this well. It's not feasible, and it's not practical from a funding perspective either. And I think there really is amazing potential if we can do this right and get the social scientists and the humanists and the area studies folks into the design phase of research projects, then some really powerful work can come out of it. I think it also requires us to have a lot more training in how to collaborate and work across fields and check some of our suspicions about other fields at the door, at least for a little while, because you really care about a topic. That's my one. Sorry, didn't mean to preach, but I do think that's true. But better that way than seeing these fields as unrelated or in competition with each other. And then lastly is the relevance of what we do to practice and policy and the public. Again, not at all unique to area studies. This is pressure that's being put on scholarship generally. For Africa, there are particular issues that we hear about and that get emphasized. The sources of this come from funders, from policymakers, from NGOs, from activists. And again, I think it's important that we define this in a very broad way so that it often gets reduced to a question of policy relevance, and that then raises all kinds of questions about politics and state power. I think policy relevance is a really important thing, but it's not the only way you can think about why the research that we do matters to other stakeholders, other non-academically based constituents, and that whichever ones you feel as a researcher you want to affect, that being more explicit about how to do that well, and again, something we're not really trained to do very well in much of our fields, is both valuable to do but also strategically important at this moment. And I think that making the work we do more accessible to various constituencies is just something that we have to. Again, there are lots of really interesting experiments on this, and just bringing it together and learning from it, I think, is really critical. And again, I know a lot of you out there have had experiences in this space. So let me get to to conclude, and I just want to make sure that we have plenty of time to have an open discussion. So again, none of what I'm saying has not been addressed. It's just that it tends to get addressed in a kind of institution by institution way, and not enough learning across and understanding both what works and what doesn't, and what kind of division of labor there could be, so that not every institution is doing the same version of something, and that requires a lot more coordination than I think we've been able to have up until now. So Area Studies has engaged in different ways and to different degrees with all these winds of change. And the key challenge is not to be carried along by the winds, but to direct them in ways that preserve the core values of deep knowledge and connection to place. I think that, that to me is the non-negotiable. That has to be a value in and of itself for what some social scientists do. It's not everybody, but it needs to be a value that's there, protected, extended, and brought into discussion with other scholarly values. And the message is that this not be zero-sum, that it need not be zero-sum. We need not think of it that way, and it need not be, and ideally funders and university administrators need not think of it that way. And that for area studies, I think there are just amazing potentials, and again, we need to learn from what's already being done in turning into the field, the centers, the area associations into bridges, to not circle the wagons, but to figure out a way to bridge. It's not easy. It takes a lot of hard work, but I think it's really the only way forward. Because I don't think circling the wagons is going to help in the end. I think it's going to make it even harder. And so I think being a bridge to different kinds of intellectual and scholarly ways of thinking and discourses and kinds of research, to different kinds of bridges to different kinds of networks and institutions, is really, really where this is about. How do we bring together what we've been learning across all the responses to these pressure points? So to return to this, if area studies in the United States didn't exist, would it need to be reinvented? So here's my 2 cents. Yes, but it would embrace the porous nature, the inevitably porous nature of areas, and therefore of area studies, as porous as objects of study. That places have their own dynamics, but they are also shaped by other places, and they shape other places. Porous, that in the sense that the community of scholars are porous, both across the borders of disciplines and fields, perhaps taking us into the kinds of fields where, like public health or education, here at MSU, you've been doing this for such a long time because of the land grant history and the history of agricultural work. But a lot of, not at other area studies centers, when I got to Columbia in the early 90s, there was huge amounts of interest in the public health school and Teachers College, the ed school, a few other parts of the university. And the faculty and the students in those schools were completely disconnected from the center I was the assistant director of, the African Studies Center. It was like that center was for the disciplines in the liberal arts only. And that was not by design. It just kind of happened that way over, through practice. And I think that's where I feel is a hugely important kind of thing we need to be conscious of going forward. So the communities of scholars are porous, both across disciplines and fields, but also across international borders, and that's especially the question of working with scholars in different parts of the world, not just bringing them in as research assistants to projects we've already designed, but through a kind of difficult but it's essential collaborative process. And then lastly, the boundaries between knowledge producers and other constituencies are also porous. And again, the area studies, I think, is naturally placed to be this bridge builder. And that's where I think that it would be essential to reinvent area studies probably in any event, but to reinvent it vigorously and to make it continue to have it be important in scholarship and in the world going forward. Embracing that bridging role, I think, is just to these different turning these pressure points into advantages and sources of strength, I think, is the main message. That can be done in a variety of ways, and through capacity building programs in parts of the world, through team research projects that bring together scholars who don't normally cross, and again, it's worth doing because it makes area studies vigorous. It also makes it and essential. It also makes it more, for a pragmatic reason, it makes more of a case for funders to invest in it. That's really where I'd like to end. So the kitschy conclusion is to make sure that the arrows go both ways, and the typo replicated on this one. So remember that one is directions in research and trading. And I am with this image with the arrows pointing both ways, but I really, and I think that's important because to the degree that we can imagine it this way, then we have a sense of agency. That it's not just us being buffeted, it's us kind of doing something about it. But I really want to hear from you all who've had lots of different kinds of experiences in this space, how we can learn from each other and build on that. So I'll end right there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ron. Now, we do have time for questions, and we have a microphone that we'll pass. This microphone is actually for the live stream, so it's not an amplification microphone, but it's important that you use it so that we can hear everyone's voice. And should we pass a microphone? Nicole? Okay, good. Yeah, the end. Okay, we'll just grab some.
You might want to just, 2 or 3 questions at a time.
Yeah, that's great.
And I'll let you run the show if you need me.
Okay, yeah.
Right. So my question, thank you so much, Ron, for this. And my question is, I have seen recently that the U.S. Department of Defense has become very active in funding lesser commonly taught languages, having a very strategic interest in understanding regions and building out capacity. And that's been a little bit of a touchy area for area study centers, I think, over the years. Could you comment on that in terms of not only the potential there, but some of the potential reservations with looking at the Department of Defense as a potential funder and strategic partner in the future?
Yeah, thank you for throwing out the third rail right at the beginning. And of course, as has been noted by others, it's not even clear that there's less funding for area studies from the federal government. It's just a huge amount of it has been shifted from, or the State Department and Education Department funding has been either leveled out or reduced, and huge increases for various programs within the Department of Defense. And boy, I think in some ways that's a question that's really got to be discussed and debated within institutions. I don't have a right answer for it. I do think that there's 2 important ways to think about it, and that both are really essential. One is that, it's the Defense Department, and that takes on a huge kind of symbolic value, especially in the US, given the histories going back to Vietnam and earlier. The Remember Area Studies is a product of what became the CIA in the 1940s. No Office of Special Services, Secret Services, OSS, no area studies. That was born in fighting World War II. That said, things changed over time, and the U.S. role globally changed over time. So I think that's a hard one. On the other hand, I do always think to me, as important a question as where the money comes from, it always has to be what strings are attached. And strings can be attached from foundations, strings can be attached from other things. And I do think that from what I know of the Defense Department funding, some of them come with much more serious strings than others. But I think the debate about whether it matters what the strings are, or it matters where it comes from, is something that each institution's got to deal with.
Thank you for that, Ron. And if I could, I'd like to actually, I think I have a comment more than a question, but I'd pick up on that question. It strikes me that maybe one of the reasons we've seen this shift is precisely because some of the things that were challenging area studies 20 or 30 years ago actually led to a bit of an eclipse for a little while, and they needed to be invented, and the defense departments, those are the people who invented it. In other words, it shifted the focus as it got attacked from one side towards the other. Maybe at least that's a way to think about why that might have happened, that we have seen this increasing funding, the shift in where the funding comes from. But just maybe as a comment, I'm really, thank you so much for this. I think you're spot on. And it sort of historicized it a little bit, 25 years ago or so, 20 years ago, in the mid-90s or something, I think. I remember the president of the SRC, was it Calhoun at the time? Would he have been in
It probably was Ken Pruitt.
Oh, Ken Pruitt.
But it was right before Calhoun.
I was an assistant professor in a Midwestern university in political science with a huge debate about area studies, and these were big stakes, and there was coming to see, I remember the politics were, was he going to pronounce the death of area studies or the importance of area studies, right? And it was sort of, he fudged on it a bit. As I recall at the time, the Social Science Research Council dismantled its area studies committee structure, right? There used to be the Committee on Africa and the Committee on, is that right?
Yes, and then reconstituted area committees that weren't mostly Americans.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So anyway, I guess my point is that I think there's been sort of a full circle, and the observation is that these winds of change are really winds that are actually, it strikes me, as actually demanding more area studies and deeper area studies and better area studies rather than challenging area studies. Right? 25 years ago, we were talking about, will area studies continue to exist? Is it worthwhile? Do we need any more universal statements of the comparative politics kind to replace it, et cetera, in my field? And I think the answer is very resounding no. It's still there. And in many ways, these are demands for doing the kinds of things that I think places like Michigan State, I like to think my own institution in Florida, are already doing, collaborating more with scholars, engaging in practice, trying to expand into the agricultural and public health and applied fields, et cetera. And so I think that I guess to underline your point at the beginning, it's more of a comment than a question. It was an experiment that was actually very successful and continues to be, I think, in many ways.
No, I agree, and I think that's where that kind of zero-sum logic and I think it's funny how it sometimes still creeps back in. SSRC's just as a kind of comparison. SSRC's early mission was not to do international work; it was to create a space for interdisciplinary work, right? And so. And there are lots of debates, there are now encyclopedias on interdisciplinary. There's probably a discipline of interdisciplinary studies somewhere. But there's a debate that's always gone there about, do you get good disciplines are in the way of interdisciplinary work, or you can't have good interdisciplinary work when you don't have strong disciplines. And the answer is yes. Both are true. But I think that's the same, I would say the same with sort of area studies and global studies. And that was partly that quote. You can't have serious work, an understanding of global phenomena if you don't have that deep knowledge. It's not, you know, in the old language of graduate school, necessary, but not sufficient.
Thanks, Ron, for your excellent information here. There are a couple questions that came to my mind and a couple other wins I want to suggest. So the first question was this issue of the departure of economics from the list. And I was curious why it was not there. So what I thought was, could that be the demise or the falling out of the grace of the socialist/communist economic model, the falling out of the grace of the Ron Purvish center periphery model, where there is no other strong challenge to capitalism. And I think when there was a strong economic challenge to capitalism when the USSR was strong, then there was a need to look at other economic models. But it appears that with the demise of those other economic models, that the capitalistic model has been dubbed the world model, and therefore it's not necessarily area studies. It's just economics has really become Western economics. It's not these other economic systems. So that's a question. And then I was thinking about this issue of the shift in study, and our colleagues at Howard were looking at how we are studying Africa. And a lot of the studies in the past was studies of Africa. And my colleagues now are talking about we need to study for Africa. That we were studying about Africa to be used by the US. But now the issue is study for Africa, for Africans. And so while we were looking at this, and one of the reasons that seemed to be the push is the rise in African scholars and the rise in African wealth. Because as African scholars begin to take their place in the discussion of Africa, their perspective is not simply about Africa, but it's now for Africa. And it's not generated to necessarily fund the perspective of a nation and nation building, but the nation building that they're talking about is their own nation. And I was thinking about that in terms of what I would call the Africanization of the ASA, African Studies Association. And what do I mean by that? If you study the early history of the ASA, of which you're familiar with, the ASA looks very different today than what it looked like when it started. And the biggest difference from some perspective is what the leadership looks like. But the leadership in the first ASA were not African. They were American. That the board of directors and the leadership of the ASA is now African. So it's the Africanization of the African studies that I call the African Studies Association that is now being led by African, which puts a different twist on why the study anyway. Mm-hmm. It's more about, well, let's not study about Africa, well, let's study for Africa. Let's produce study that's going to benefit. So it's just why study it at all? So the issue of Africans is not, well, I'm not interested in studying about Africa because I want to increase my knowledge. I want to study about Africa so I can build my nation. So the study of Africa is being pushed for by Africans has a very, very different motive. It's not as ethereal, it's not as, I mean, it's academic, but it's much more practical in terms of why they're even studying it at all. And lastly is really a question and a comment together. Is this new shift, I think is going to continue to change because of the rise in African scholars, the increase in African scholars, and the increase in African wealth, which is going to fund African scholarship. As long as African scholarship is funded by those outside of Africa, that scholarship is going to have a particular, it's going to look a particular way. When that scholarship is funded by Africans, for Africans, it will look differently. And so what we may really be looking at is not necessarily the demise of area studies, but we really might be experiencing the maturation of area studies fueled by the rise in African scholars and the ability of Africa to fund its own research.
Should we take a couple, you think? Thank you. Any others? All right. Come on.
Traditionally, Northern Africa is placed within the Middle East studies. And my question is, since I don't come from, traditionally, Northern Africa studies are placed within the Middle East studies. And since I'm not from the African studies, my question is, how much the Northern Africa is within the African studies, and how much Middle Eastern scholarship deals with the rest of Africa? Thank you.
I also have a question about donors. And you mentioned in this talk the shift in donors, right? That at the beginning of the area studies model, we had certain kinds of investments in, especially U.S. education and increasingly in international education or international scholarship. We've since seen the entree of a whole new slew of donors. I'm thinking about the Gates Foundation, about Fed, I'm thinking about China, I'm thinking about all sorts of other things. I'm wondering if you want to speculate at all about the impact that this new generation of donors might be having on the nature or focus of area studies.
Okay. Just starting with the middle one first, because it's easiest for me to say that I don't know a lot. And I think the other people in this room do about the intersection of North Africa. I do think that one thing I know that's interesting is that scholars on the African continent, and for example, the organization Cadesria, includes North Africa as part of Africa, so that it's not they don't carve up Africa in the way that American Area Studies has in the past. And I think that that's our structure for it is a phenomenon of that evolution of the war and also post-war World War II scholarship, but also colonial kinds of engagements. But others, I think, in this room know a lot more than I do about that. On the donor question, I think it would be I certainly couldn't generalize, and I don't think one could, because the Gates Foundation and the Chinese probably have somewhat different priorities, other than they both want to project their power as much as possible within how they define it. But I think there are folks. I wouldn't even speculate about China, because there's other people in this room who know so much more than me. On some of the newer philanthropies like Gates, and I think what I haven't seen, though I would be thankful if others can have examples. I haven't seen much interest in that kind of support for deep scholarship that goes along with the problem-solving orientation toward research. So I think I think what's happened so much in the foundation world, including the new ones, is a kind of it's important. There are more important things in the world than helping social scientists and humanists do what they do. We want to address that. If social scientists and humanists can help us solve those problems, we'll involve them to that degree. And you know, it's really important for philanthropies to address things that are really immediate and problematic in the world. I think what's happened is that all of them are doing that. And so it creates there's a collective action problem where hardly any of them, Mellon and Carnegie being the two sort of exceptions that I know of, are worried about what happens in 10 years. Where do we get the capacity to understand something, especially the capacity that's going to involve this deep contextual knowledge? Where's that going to come from without some purposeful support? So I think it's a collective action problem, is that everyone's pressure from, all the foundation's pressures from their boards are, how can we show that we've solved this problem right away? And then to go to, you may raise so many things, Wheeler, I don't know where to start, but other than yes, on The Economist, I don't know if Siddharth is here, but you know, he gave another side of an additional dimension to that of the sort of the dynamics within the economics profession, at least in the United States, around this kind of decoupling with area knowledge. And I have some thoughts about it, but not very coherent. And in terms of the African scholars and I love what you said about the Africanization of the ASA, which sounds like an oxymoron, but isn't, right? It really is. You know, you would think, wasn't it always Africanized? But of course, that wasn't true. I think one thing that's really interesting within what you've said, and this is not only point you made, is the incredible change within the professoriate here in the US of African-born scholars who have taken such great leadership roles in African studies centers, in various departments, in the ASA, and Carnegie Corporation is funding now, not through us, with the IIE, a program to involve US-based scholars from Africa and giving them support to engage in collaborative and capacity building work with African universities and African colleagues, so that, you know, it's not 20 years ago, it was how do we reverse the brain drain, as if, you know, you could control people's life decisions about what they were going to do with their careers and their families. So I think things have gotten a little bit more practical now, and it's okay, these people have relocated to the US, they've established important careers here. They are deeply committed to the situation of scholarship in their own countries. What are some ways to enable that contribution to happen that's not about reversing the brain drain? What do they call it now? Brain circulation? Yeah, I don't know. The World Bank will always come up with a term for something. But thank you. Those were all great comments.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ron. This was very helpful to think about these things. And you just said something that really seemed to resonate for me, that it's not just the institutions, but really scholarly cultures or even habits that make us forget that there's a porous world out there. And I just wondered if you might reflect on that a little bit more, because I think often we want to, somehow it's easy to make the institution the scapegoat, but sometimes we're just locked into habits, I think, in scholarship. And I think that's what was fun this morning, was getting a group of people together, not to talk about what we know, but kind of what we don't know and how we might imagine new ways of thinking about the world. And I just wondered if you had any reflections on why cultures and habits are so powerful and strong, or just anything more you have to say about that.
I'll probably better answered by the anthropologists in the room, sure. But I can't say that I'm not an institutional ethnographer of academic departments. Probably it would be both a little bit self-indulgent, but also really valuable for there to be more research on us. And so I think it's a really complicated question, and I think some of it are impingements from outside and the sense of siege. A natural instinct is often to rally to circle the wagons and take a kind of defensive stance because you're often being put on the defensive. And sometimes we may over-exaggerate the threat, but it doesn't mean it's not there. So I think that's part of it. I think also that there are really important things about close-knit communities. They give huge amounts of value, right? And I know one of the things when I was a graduate student and kind of got deep into the area studies and African studies community and cared, it was like a home. Especially if you were in a department like mine in political science, where out of 100 graduate students, there were like 2 doing PhDs with doing fieldwork on Africa. So there are some real values that are met by this kind of sense that you're in something together. But there are also some downsides to that, like families, right? You can get very insular. And I think that for me, a real, maybe one of the things that I would love us all to think about is, what are the ways that you can keep some of those really important things that are central to your identity as a scholar, that you have a commitment to a place that's not purely rational. It's like, you did research there, you develop relationships, things happen, and you develop this kind of deep identity, but to continue that in a way that still allows for the porousness, rather than, I own this space and you are a stranger to it. You haven't spent the year and a half that I did of field work, you public health worker, you economist who comes in for 3 weeks. That's not legitimate. Only the way I engage Africa is legitimate. That's the downside, is that I think, but it comes from a good place. It comes from this need for network and community.
So just a general question. So what you're kind of suggesting is, what I would ask is, in order to make sure we aren't developing urgency within fields, even people who are saying my way is the best way, do you think it would be good to have doctrines that are in direct, I guess you could say opposition? For example, if we want to better understand how to develop economic systems, we could put people who are on the side of capitalism, people on the side of socialism in similar fields or interacting together frequently, so no one can just say, my way is the best way. If that makes any sense.
I think it makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
Yes, that is a better way of saying what I was saying than I did. Thank you.
Thank you. You talked about some of the past political dynamics. I think you talked about the past political dynamics. Do you have any comment on how European political dynamics, nationalism, also nationalism within the United States might affect future area studies? We talked about the Cold War, but there are other sorts of major political formations that could affect area studies.
Yeah. Should we take another one, if there are any?
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. My question has to do with sharing the African scholarship with bigger African community that you mentioned, from area studies, we are looking into global studies, not throwing away the area studies, but deepening the area studies by widening the net to have more participation of African scholars. And in the 10 years I have been following the ASA has been happening in the US, and only few African scholars are able to come to the U.S. for so many reasons. Do you have any comments or an idea in terms of this win in the 4 areas you mentioned, how ASA can also happen on the continent in order to make this cooperation or interdisciplinary partnership even more stronger?
There may be people here who know more about the ASA than I do. And I think, Wheeler had mentioned that you're seeing much more African presence at the conferences, and I think that's true. Whether those are Africans who are here as faculty or students or people who are coming just for the conference, obviously there's some big resource constraints there. But I don't know, anyone who knows ASA better than me?
About that, Idris. Yeah, so I think the ASA in the last couple of years, I really think they're trying hard to make more connections with African studies in Africa. So I think the sense is that as an African Studies Association, the ASA has its best partners with African Studies Associations in Africa. And so they've partnered, at least, I think there's been one conference in Ghana, one in South Africa,
Right.
and one in Senegal. So
Right.
they're trying not to cancel the annual meeting in the United States, but to have more meetings on the continent and to make sure that it's not a bifurcated system where Africans only go to African ASA meetings and Americans only go to American ones, but rather there's a real strong encouragement for people to go in both directions. There are fellows programs to bring African scholars, but the funding is very limited, and that's been really frustrating for many of us that there hasn't been a bigger commitment to fund African participation. But I think the ASA is on that trajectory, and I think we all have to say, great job, keep it up. So it keeps going.
Yeah. Yeah. So just to your comment, Shabana, I mean, I don't know. I think, going back to something Leo said very early on, obviously the shift of funding for certain kinds of area expertise to defense agencies was a product of 9/11, largely. I mean, very much a product of 9/11. So not only that, but it's unimaginable that the extent of the degree to which the defense agencies have gotten involved in scholarship would have happened without 9/11. So, the moment we're in now is frightening in a lot of ways, and whether or not how it might affect funding, I don't know. It's not like before the rise of certain kinds of populism or nationalisms that it was all that easy for appropriators to decide to support Title VI or support. It was a hard fight before the current administration and before Brexit and before the rise of populist right-wing parties in Europe. So, how much harder? I don't. Maybe anyone. I really don't have a sense.
I have one thing that I thought I might say, just in response perhaps to this, but also to an earlier question about the Defense Department, because we were just on the Hill 2 weeks ago to do advocacy for federal funding for area studies. And Miriam Kazanjian, who's our lobbyist, told us to directly speak to President Trump's budget, where Trump basically said, we don't need Title VI, we don't need international education because that's better done by national security agencies. So Miriam told us how to teach the representatives that that's incorrect. And then the truth of the matter is, the Defense Department wouldn't be able to teach a single language if it weren't for us. We train the Africa specialists and the language teachers that they use. We actually do more for their work than is ever made visible. And they can never reproduce the university. They might be able to do language training, but it would be out of context. You might as well just use Google Translate. There's if you don't know the linguistic context of language, you aren't learning a language at all. You're just becoming a translator. Maybe that's what they think it is that they need, but it's not what they need. And so that is one part, but then thinking about the donors, the foundations that want to go out and solve malaria, but not fund the public health training and schools and degrees that we all need, and the partnerships and all that context that we have to really address disease. So there's a kind of a subsidy from area studies to solving all these problems, a subsidy from area studies to defense and national security, and it's not known. We're not doing a good enough job of telling people what we're worth and what it takes to keep us going and how important we are. So I just spent a couple days on Washington talking like that, and it helped me see how important it is for us to communicate well about what we do. So that's my pitch for area studies. And it's not just for Africa, it goes across areas.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question if there is one, and if not, I think our group will go back to our, in the light, go back to our symposium. So let's all give a great round of applause to them.
Thank you.
And thank you all so much for coming. Next week, I'm sorry, I chased Liz away. Liz, would you like...